This video introduces ancient Egypt, and we'll discuss some chronology and geography and the earliest signs of social stratification and kingship in the Egyptian society, beginning in and around 3000 BC, just like we saw in Mesopotamia. Now, there are a couple important concepts to keep in mind in order to understand Egyptian art that deal with geography. First of all, the Nile just cuts through the Sahara Desert. And the Sahara had been desertified, dried up for several thousands of years by the time of 3000. And it was therefore the lifeblood of Egypt and would continue to be so throughout the rest of history. It flows from south to north and then feeds out into the delta, which is a rich marshy area that produces a lot of food. This is similar to the Mississippi Delta in Louisiana. It's constantly growing and getting larger with the effluence of the Nile. Now, since the Nile runs from south to north, the lower part of Egypt is called Upper Egypt, and the northern part is called Lower Egypt. It all has to do with the flow of the Nile. I give you a couple slides here, or a couple maps, because the one on the left points out where some of the important sites will be. For example, the pyramids on the upper left or in the northern area, and then some very important sites are to the south. But the important thing to keep in mind is that Egyptians did not consider their country whole unless Lower and Upper Egypt were combined, were under one kingship. And this has a lot to do with their with not only their chronology, but with the iconography of kingship in the artwork that we will see. A couple of things I want to point out is you'll notice in the left-hand slide, the most southern area is called Lower Nubia. On the right-hand side, it's called Kush. Kush was the one that was used for the most part of the periods we're going to talk about. The name Nubia would come around later on. You can also see clearly on the left-hand map where it says First Cataract and Second Cataract. These cataracts are waterfalls. When you have cataracts in your eyes, it looks like you're looking through waterfalls. Just comes from Latin or from Greek to mean to flow down. I've not seen the second cataract, but I had the opportunity to see the first cataract. And it really isn't waterfalls as much as it is a very shallow part of the Nile River. So deep-keeled boats would not have been able to navigate it, and therefore large supplies would not have been able to go back and forth. And it was just a barrier on the Nile. But I'll show you that later on. I want you to focus, however, for today's lecture on the site of Hierakonpolis on the left-hand side of the Nile, a little bit south of Memphis, near the pyramids. And that points out one other thing, is that the cities in which the Egyptians lived were on the eastern or right-hand side of the Nile. The cemeteries, the necropolis, the dead cities, were on the west side. And this is because the Egyptians were sun worshippers, so you lived where the sun rose, and when you died, you were buried where the sun set. Now, back to the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. This would have a lot to do with how we understand the chronology. A chronology that was set up by a Greek by the name of Manetho. I'll talk more about that in a later video of how the chronologies were figured out. In this slide, you can see that there's three names on the right, Kitchen, Grimal, and Roll, where they sort of disagree on the precise dates. That does not concern us here. I'm more concerned about the relative dates or the sequence and knowing just generally when they are. The unification was important because the name kingdom would only be used for when Lower and Upper Egypt were unified. So you can see Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, and then the late period. And they are divided by what's called the intermediate periods, 1, 2, and 3. And those intermediate periods were when the Lower and Upper Egypt were not unified. Now, that has nothing to do, difficultly enough, with dynasties. The dynasties could come and go. Family powers could come and go. The capitals as cities could change over time. So just because it's Old Kingdom, do not think it's constantly the same family. That becomes all the more so evident in the New Kingdom. On the bottom of it, we will get into in the late period the Persians and then the Greeks and the Romans. But today's lecture, we're going to talk about the early dynastic and archaic, what's called the pre-dynastic period, up to the second dynasty, to the second dynasty, and then the Old Kingdom will begin, and we'll get the pyramids and other things. But first, I want to talk about some general ideas and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Before we can get to that, you have to understand some general ideas in order to understand the symbols that we're going to see and the iconography that we're going to see. And the first has to do with an overarching faith in the myriad of myths and gods that the Egyptians had. This story of Osiris is an overarching one. And I'm going to give you a general layout of it right now. We're going to talk about it in greater details in later classes. Here we see in the center Osiris. He holds the crook and the flail, objects that shepherds use. Crooks to grab the sheep around their neck, flails to sort of pat them on the behind to keep them moving. And the idea of a king was that he was the shepherd, and the people are the sheep or the flock. We can see this metaphor goes back well before Christianity. His wife would be is Isis, who interestingly enough would become a really popular deity in the Roman period, a bit later than we will talk about in this class. Now, Osiris had a rather nasty brother called Set or Seth, replicated by the Set animal on the lower right. And he usurped power from his brother Osiris and chopped them up into little bits and sprinkled them all up and down the Nile and the Mediterranean, etc. Isis, his wife, goes and collects all those parts and puts them back together for a long enough period that she can make love with him, and then he dies, but she is impregnated by Horus, the falcon-headed god, on the right. Now, Horus would represent the living gods. By the way, notice that both Horus and Isis carry what are called Ankh symbols, this cross with the loop on the top, and these are symbols of life. And so Horus would come to represent the living gods, and Osiris would become the equivalent of Saint Peter at the pearly gates for the ancient Egyptians. He was the one, after you died, who would cast judgment on you. And I'll talk about this more when we talk about the Book of the Dead. By the way, he is shown green here. Sometimes he is shown blue because he's dead. But it's important to understand the falcon-headed deity as representing the living king. On the upper right, we see this triad with Osiris in the center. To his left, our right, is Isis. And to his right, our left, is Horus. Notice how they both put their hands on his shoulders to show obedience to him. The first object we need. Okay, on the left, we can see, I'm sorry, on the first side of the slide, on the top, we can see two bulls with horns. These represent the deity Bat, which is a god of heavens. This can be confusing because at times this will look like Hathor, a later deity, or another deity, I should say. But in this case, it represents the heavens. In between is a symbol I'll show you a detail of in a moment called the Sarek symbol, which encloses the names, the titulary names of the king slash pharaoh. In this case, Narmer. I'll come back to that in a moment. Narmer stands center in a position that we will see throughout Egyptian history because it represents one of power. We can see his legs are in profile position, his torso frontal. He holds in his right hand a mace, and he is about to smash the skull of a defeated foe here in purple, whose hair he holds. Now, I'll show this in a moment, but the crown that he wears, Narmer, shows that he is a king from Upper Egypt, and that this person on kneeling down, who's about to be killed, is most likely from Lower Egypt, from the marsh area, and there are reasons that emphasize this. For example, above him are a series of 6 papyri in a pot, and standing on that pot is Horus, the falcon-headed god, and he holds a string that comes down to the nose and goes through the nose of a head similar to the head of the man that's about to be killed. And the papyri are very common in the delta region of Lower Egypt. So this king is showing that he has power over him. Behind Narmer is the sandal bearer, much smaller than he, one showing that he has an inferior social status, a concept we've discussed a lot, but also notice the ground line in him, and it might also reflect the fact that he's behind him distance-wise. He carries his sandals in his left hand and a water jug in his right, and there's a little rosette symbol behind him, probably indicating his importance. Now, Narmer stands on top of 2 figures that are dead. There is a little square of a walled city beside them, but don't worry about that in this case here. But notice that they are floating and showing that they are lifeless. And these are people that he's already conquered. Here we see the Sarek symbol on the top, on the right here, which is on the top of the palette. And interestingly enough, the name Narmer is the phonetic values, the sounds of the word for a catfish, which we see on the top, and a drill on the bottom. And there are many parts of the early pre-dynastic language that have not been understood quite yet. But here we see that the sounds of a specific symbol can be used as names. And then he is, the drill is set between 2 temples facing him. I just give you another example on the left. This is another Sarek of a different pharaoh, which shows once again the facade of a temple, a snake or serpent above that, but then notice the falcon on top, showing that this is showing it is Horus, and therefore the name of a pharaoh. The pharaohs had several titulary names that they called Horus names. Back to the symbols themselves, we see the catfish and the drill on the upper left. Some of these on the right, we simply don't know what they mean. This is so early in the use of Egyptian hieroglyphs that scholars have yet to figure them out. They know what sounds a lot of them have, but they don't know if the meaning is the same of later symbols. Now, before we turn to this second side of it, I want to point out that these pharaohs' crowns have great significance. And on the left, you see the white crown of Upper Egypt. In the middle, the red crown of Lower Egypt. And then on the right, the crown of a united Egypt. Notice that in the text there, it says the pharaoh Menes. Sometimes he is referred to Menes. I'm not sure exactly why that is. Perhaps it has to deal with his real name versus his pharaonic name. But for our purposes, we'll stay with Narmer. I want you to pay attention to these crowns, and we will see other crowns in the future. The Egyptians had endless amounts of crowns for their pharaohs. I want you to know these three on the top here for now. We'll get to the other crowns later, and indeed we'll talk about more than what's even shown here. I do want to point out, going back to the first side, that Narmer is wearing, first of all, a bull's tail, because as a pharaoh, he is like a bull. And notice on his kilt, this tight kilt, that there are 4 columns, and on the top of the columns, like a column capo, are these horned bulls again, representing Bat. I would like you to sort of remember these columns, because we'll see that early on, we believe that columns were actually made by the binding of tree trunks, and that would eventually lead to fluting, which is very common on both Egyptian and Greek and Roman columns, who would copy these later on. So these early columns were, I don't know if they were palm tree trunks or whatever, but you can see them bound together there. Please keep that in mind. Okay, on the other side, we see the same thing in the top register, right? The goddess Bat, or perhaps the goddess Hathor, and his Serek symbol or Serek name in the middle. But here on the left, Narmer walks again with his assistant behind him. But here he wears a different crown. He wears the red crown, the crown of northern or Lower Egypt. I will show you details of these in a moment. His hieroglyphic name, catfish drill, are there in front of his face. He carries his mace in his left hand. In front of him is some sort of attendant whose name we're given, but we don't know who it is. Then there are 4 men carrying standards that have an animal skin, a terrestrial quadruped of some sort, and 2 falcons. Following that, in the purple, there is a boat whose significance is unknown, a boat preceded by a swallow. But then below that, shown in mixed perspectives, that is to say, from above rather than in profile like the rest of this register, are 10 headless bodies with their arms bound behind their backs at their elbows. And their heads are placed in between their legs, and their penises are put on top of their heads to show complete and absolute subjugation and humiliation of the enemy. In the middle, we have 2 things called serpopods. These are a Mesopotamian import that I'll discuss in a little bit. They are, serpopod is a modern word, a mixture of leopard and with a serpent head. They look sort of like brontosauruses. Their necks are combined or intertwined as an obvious symbol of unification of north and south. 2 servants hold them by leashes. I don't know if you can tell, but on the one on the left, the leash is not held as tautly as the one on the right. And some people have interpreted that to mean that this is of Upper Egypt, and so it doesn't need as tight of a rein as Lower Egypt would. And then that is above the bottom register, which shows a bull, which represents the pharaoh, standing on a man, and then plowing through the walls of a city, shown in aerial view, and a mastaba inside of that. A mastaba is a type of burial structure used before pyramids. So I know these are all separate, are all very small in this image, but we can look at some details of it. For example, here we see once again the pharaoh. Here, Narmer carrying his mace and flail and having the same kilt on, except that he has the crown of Lower Egypt. And you can see a detail of the men there shown in an aerial perspective. We have to get used to this mixture of perspectives. The Egyptians did it all the time, and you just have to get used to looking at it as such. These serpopods are quite interesting. This is a seal and its impression from Uruk. Imagery from there. And by the way, this is a pure. The first object we need in other palettes that come from the pre-dynastic period, and here's another one from Hierakonpolis, and it's called the two dog palette, because we can see two dogs on the left-hand image. We see dogs on each side, but then these serpopods, once again encircling around the area where the makeup would be mixed. We see a bunch of animals on the bottom and on the back side, some real, some not. My point is this: is that this serpopod image is seen on other items and other palettes, and then also that these palettes are not uncommon. Here's one called the Hunter's palette here, of pre-dynastic date. You don't have to know it. I'm just trying to explain to you that there are many of these. And by the way, when I showed the last one and had the Ashmolean in red, I was thinking that perhaps this would be the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford has a fair amount of these palettes, and one of them might be a good paper topic. Now I'm going to talk about some mace heads, one of Narmer's as shown on the right, and one of the Scorpion King shown on the left. These two were found in the foundation deposit under a temple at Hierakonpolis, and were buried when the temple was built, only to be re-seen again in the late 19th century when they were discovered. Let's first look at the scorpion mace head. Here you see what's left of the mace on the left. If you look at the drawing on the right, you can see the scorpion king in the middle. There are standards above him, in this case holding animal skins. This will be a symbol we'll see a lot of. He himself holds a hoe, and there are fields and streams around him. Let me show you a better detail. He holds a hoe. Now, this is not the hoe that we might be used to. This would be one that would be the left-hand part of it, which he holds in his right hand, would have been attached by some sort of yoke to cattle, and they would have dragged it to our left. And that bottom part, the pointed part near the very bottom of his kiln, would be the part that would turn up the soil. He has, and notice to his bottom right is a man holding a basket, as if to collect the soil. We see at the front of this pharaoh's face a scorpion. We really don't know what the name of this king is, but based on what we can tell from the Narmer palette, the rosette probably represents some sort of kingship, and then the scorpion is perhaps his name, but it's not certain. We see to the upper right, once again, these standards being carried by assistants, just like we saw in the Narmer palette. But here we get an additional thing, and we see the fan bearers behind Narmer, or behind the Scorpion King here. Different types of fans that we saw in Mesopotamia, but the same idea. And notice he wears the crown of Upper Egypt. And back to a detail of the drawing, I do want to point out here too that it looks like he is perhaps standing on some sort of river here that flows down, and we see some men on each side perhaps working the soil. They look like they're holding it up. But a man on the lower part with himself holding a hoe, and then a potted tree above him. The important part is we can see the comparative iconography that we saw on the Narmer palette. Once again, this is on a mace head. So these maces would be carried by the king as a sign of his royalty, carried by a pharaoh, the sign of his royalty, and could also be used to clubbing people over the head. And there is a mace head that is dedicated to Narmer, and was found with the other mace head, and is perhaps the mace head depicted in the Narmer palette. This is sort of hard to read from these photographs, but I do want to point out that we know it's Narmer because in the one on the right, look to the top right center, and we can see the Serek symbol again, or just the Serek, with the catfish and the drill. So this is Narmer. He is seated here in a little kiosk or a little temple on the left center register, where he receives prisoners of war. These three guys with beards on the right-hand part of the central register are prisoners of war. The crescents on each side show that are symbols of royalty. Behind them, we see a man with his arms bound behind his back. Below, we see some of the animals that are have been taken by Narmer in some sort of conquest here. To the lower left, we see the steps leading up to this temple with Narmer sitting in it and the fan bearers in front. The top right, we once again see these standard bearers, very similar to those that we saw on the Narmer palette. What's interesting in this one is that above Narmer's head is another symbol you're going to have to get used to, and that is the neckbet vulture of Upper Egypt. And we're going to see this guy very often in the iconography. And he holds what's called the Ak symbol, which is an image of the sun on the horizon. As we will see, we're going to learn a lot of different symbols, and I'm going to have to teach you a lot of different iconography to understand what's going on in Egyptian art. But one of the really wild things about it is they didn't just have the concept of the sun. There was a concept of the sun on the horizon, the sun, high in the sky, etc. And I'm going to introduce these to you slowly because they're just way too overwhelming to do all at once. And moreover, there's far more than we could get through in a semester. But here are just some of the basic ideas to understand the iconography and understand that Narmer was considered the unifier of Egypt, even by the later Egyptians, not just by this discovery. He's referred to by the Egyptians. One of the arguments is that perhaps the Narmer palette wasn't made by Narmer, but was made by a later period to dedicate it. For our purposes, we won't bother with that. We'll just take it as a pre-dynastic object, or an object or pre-dynastic object. And the type of artwork that we see will continue through the first and second dynasties once Egypt is unified. And then that will get us into the age of the pyramids.